Welcome to Carleton University, to this event hosted by the School of Public Policy and Administration and our Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, the first and only graduate program of its kind in Canada. Thank you all for joining us. As we begin this session, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Ashkenazi people. In addition to our education and research, the MPNL, the Master of Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership, is committed to engaging and sparking conversations with diverse audiences about philanthropy and how we can enhance the practice of philanthropy and public policy for philanthropy. I'm Susan Phillips, professor in the school and graduate supervisor of the program. It's such a pleasure. I can't begin to tell you what a pleasure it is to work with such amazing students. And we have a number of them here tonight, our students and our alum. They are truly doing audacious things, so take the opportunity later at the reception to meet them. Now, my intent was to introduce this session and then sit back and enjoy the presentations while Carleton's former president, Alistair Summerlee, moderated the discussion. But unfortunately, Alistair is not able to join us, so you're going to be stuck with me as both the introducer and the moderator. The question that we're going to explore this evening is how can we inspire philanthropy, charitable giving in particular, to do better? Rates of giving in Canada have been stagnant, even declining for a decade, particularly among high net worth households. And we're going to define how high net worth households for you in a little bit. They are in fact less generous in terms of their giving as a percentage of their income or wealth than lower or middle income households. And evidence suggests they're not giving in accordance with their capacity to do so. And many don't give at all. When we compare ourselves to the US, we actually don't compare that favorably. And it's not just because there have been some very big gifts in the US, or perhaps it is. Are the tax incentives more favorable? Is there something else going on? We're going to find out. So our plan is to get a picture of trends in the US and in Canada, explore some of the reasons for those differences, and consider how we can instill high net worth households to step up. The reason for focusing on high net worth families is not simply because that's where the money is, and we want to capture a great deal of it as we look at the intergenerational transfer of wealth that's coming, but rather research shows the positive benefits for individuals and for society as a whole of an engaged culture of philanthropy. High net worth donors have potential multiplier effects through their extensive personal and professional networks, and the charitable sector can benefit greatly from their talent and their time, as well as their treasure. So let's see where we stand and how we can do better. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers. We're delighted that Patrick Rooney, Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies, and the Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University in Indianapolis, is joining us. Welcome, Patrick. Patrick previously served as Executive Director of the Center on Philanthropy at IU, and he helped establish it as an international leader in research on philanthropy, and then to create the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school of philanthropy. We are envious and we aspire to be in the same realm. Dr. Rooney is an active researcher of philanthropy himself, including leading the Giving USA survey, as well as other studies of high net worth giving. So we've asked him to draw on his work to give us an overview of the trends in philanthropy in the US. He's joined by Mike Pedersen, who's had a distinguished career in finance, having served as president and CEO of TD Bank in the US, and previously was responsible for Barclays Global Private Bank in the UK, and before that at CIBC, and he found some time to chair the Canadian Bankers Association. Since returning to Canada, Mike now serves as chair of the board of the Business Development Bank of Canada. But those aren't the accomplishments. Those accomplishments aren't the main reason we invited him to join us today. Mike also has a long and ongoing involvement with charitable organizations in Canada, focused and internationally focused on strengthening disadvantaged urban communities and on sustainability, including serving on the board of the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Imagine Canada. And for the past few years, he's been the driving force behind the Personal Philanthropy Project at Imagine, which aims to collect better data and enhance giving by high net worth households. So we'll start with Patrick, who's going to take the time to give us patterns in the US, and there will be data. Our students love data, and they'll be, of course, taking notes. Then Mike will speak to the Canadian context. We'll have time for a discussion and for questions from you. Welcome to both of you, and over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Susan. So my one Canadian connection is my father worked for Massey Ferguson for a long time. And Mike was just telling me that in his former life, that was almost led to the demise of one of the banks. So my apologies. My dad was not that responsible. But he had an apartment in Toronto, and I always thought that was fascinating that how do you get to have a house in one city and an apartment in another, but he carried it off for a long time. And I know it existed because my mom also went there, so anyways, they love Toronto. So this is a very academic title. I apologize for that. High Net Worth Philanthropy and the Growing Bifurcation of Giving in America. And so I don't think this was exactly the assignment Susan asked me to do, but I think it's an interesting story, and hopefully go along. So I have my email on this. If you have questions that you think of later, feel free to shoot me an email. I also encourage you to check out our website. We have an interesting business model. We go out and raise money for projects first, usually, and then give the results away. And one of the reasons we do this is we're trying to build the sector and build the understanding and so on. And we know that a lot of nonprofit leaders are unable and unwilling to pay for very much research, and so we find foundations or individual donors to fund our work, and sometimes banks. And you'll see we do a study that's funded by U.S. Trust, Bank of America, on philanthropy among high net worth households, and I'll spend some time on that. Susan was talking before the conference started about a conference at USC. We have a Women's Philanthropy Institute. Deb Mesh runs that, and we have the fundraising school. We offer training programs. We have the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, and we just started the Mays Institute on Diversity and Philanthropy. And so we try to look at philanthropy in lots of different ways, but we also have some very targeted research foci. We just hired Shark Siddiqui to be the director of our initiative on Muslim philanthropy as well. So we're looking at this in lots of different ways. So one of I guess the longest running study of philanthropy in the United States, so this is all sources of giving and all uses of giving, is Giving USA. And several years ago, about 20 years ago, I was the director of research, and we brought Giving USA in as a piece of contract research, and it was a great product, and we spent a lot of time and money trying to make it better. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's a much larger report on this, but I want to point out a couple of things. When we started doing this research and writing, I had no idea how large individual giving played in total giving in the United States. Because as a faculty member, I'd written proposals to the government and to foundations and to a couple corporations. So naturally thought of those as the main sources of giving. But it turns out that household giving is about 70% of giving in the United States. Corporations is only 5%. foundations is 16%, and charitable bequests is 9%. If you add up the half of the foundation grant making that comes from family foundations and the bequest giving to the individual giving, you're looking at almost 90%. So almost 9 out of every $10 comes from individuals who are either alive, giving through their household checkbook, or their family philanthropy checkbook, or through their charitable estates. Where does the money go? Well, 31% goes to religion. 20 years ago, 40 years ago, that was over half. So dramatic sea change in giving to religion. Giving to religion has not gone down, it's continued to grow, but it's grown more slowly than giving to the other subsectors. Okay, so important for some of you perhaps, but for us it's a remarkable change. Education does very well when the stock market does well. Most of the giving to education is higher ed. And if you chart this out by link to the S&P 500, a large gift to education, very high correlation with that. Next, human services. I really point this chart out though because gifts to grant-making foundations is the 4th largest recipient of total giving in the United States. Okay, so one of the key points I want to make about the bifurcation of giving in America is that large gifts are playing an increasingly dominant role. Now, I'm an empiricist, so I'm going to point out the fact, okay, and then I'll let you judge whether that's good or bad, but I'll point out some of the good and bad things about that from my perspective, okay? But I want to point to several factoids throughout the presentation of these shifts over time that I think are important. So this is Giving USA data. So 40 years ago, 83% of all giving came from living individuals. Now it's 71%. 40 years ago, 5% came from foundations. Now it's 16%. So you can see part of this change over time, the two combined is still about the same, right? It's still, almost identically the same, and when you add a bequest, it is identically the same. But a larger and larger share is coming from organized philanthropy, organized through large and smaller family foundations, okay? Now the Lilly Endowment has been a good benefactor to us, and it is an independent foundation, but it was created by one family whose wealth came from one corporation, okay? So in many ways, it's a large family foundation that's called an independent private foundation. Okay, so most foundations, the Ford Foundation, is not a family foundation, but effectively it would be today if it were created today. All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about the high net worth household giving and the study that we've been doing since 2006 for Bank of America and U.S. Trust on philanthropy among high net worth households. And so a couple of things methodologically, just so everybody knows where we're at. This is looking at households whose annual income is at least $200,000 or more, and or their net worth is $1 million or more, excluding their primary residence. So take out your house, and what else do you have? So if you have second and third homes, that counts in your net worth. But we're really trying to look at kind of liquid assets or investable net worth as a kind of a proxy for wealth. On average, so the median net worth was $2 million. The mean net worth was $16.8 million. So there's quite a bit of the non-normal distribution, right? How many have taken stats? Everybody? So the normal distribution. All right, so one of the things about philanthropy is that it's non-normally distributed, right? A large percentage of the dollars coming from a small percentage of the people. So my little statistical humor is that the one thing we know about philanthropy is that it's all skewed up. Hey, you top that for statistical humor, I dare you. Okay, yeah. Okay, maybe after a drink or two it'd be funnier. All right, so here's some key themes from the Bank of America U.S. Trust, and I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but charitable giving is very important to high net worth households. For many people, this is how they identify themselves, because after you have 2 or 3 homes and 2 or 3 cars and lots of nice vacations, how do you motivate yourself, right? How do you stand out in your own mind, what motivates you to get up in the morning and do good or do something? And for many of these individuals, it's philanthropy. And they talk about it with great passion. So one of the things that stands out in this research and some other research that Deb Mesh and I have done, and working with Una Vasili, our director of research now, is that women are more generous than men. You know, as an old white male, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but women, when you control for differences in income, are more likely to give, and they give a higher share of their income. Okay? Now, you may have heard a rumor that men earn more than women on average, and there are different theories explaining those differences, and I'm not going into that. So men, on the nominal level, give slightly more, but when you adjust for differences in income, women give more. Diversity is playing a more important role. People talk about impact, that impact matters, and it's a big motivator to them. Right, so I'm going to go on from there. All right, so let's look at some of the empirics of the high net worth giving. So one of the things is that in every wave of this, so we've done this every other year since 2006, in every wave, high net worth households have given a very high incidence rate, so 90% or more in each wave. In fact, in the first wave, it was 97%, and I had a reporter from the Wall Street Journal call me and say, oh, that's just terrible, you know, that only 97% gave. You know, those other 3%, they should have to give. And I said, well, philanthropy is voluntary. If they have to give, that's called taxes. Big difference, right? Okay, so we're talking about voluntary activity. All right, so 85% of high net worth households give to secular charities, 49% give to religion. That suggests that about 5% only give to religion, and about 36% are only giving to secular charities. So you see some behavioral differences there, but the key takeaway is that virtually everybody is giving. Okay? Among general U.S. population, so we have two of our main studies, looking at philanthropy, is this U.S. population that's a general representation. It parallels the bottom 97, 98% perfectly in terms of income, age, race, gender, general dynamics of the U.S. population. It has some households in the top 3%, but not many, not enough to analyze statistically. So one of our motivations for partnering with Bank of America was to say, let's look at the top 3%, and then we have these two complementary data sets that you can analyze, and we based the Bank of America study questions about philanthropy with the same studies we had in the panel study. The U.S. households overall, 56% gave in the last wave that we have data for, which 47% gave to secular and 34% gave to religion. When we started doing this in 2000, about 2/3 of the households were giving. Okay, so I've got a slide coming up about that, but to foreshadow. So one of the trends for normal households, the bottom 97%, is that fewer and fewer of them are giving at all. Okay? All right, who gives? This is among the high net worth households. Women were more likely to give. Okay? And millennials were less likely to give. And among the different racial, ethnic groups, not a lot of variance. And for the last two waves, we've tried to oversample LGBTQ households, and we've some interesting results about that. But again, similar incidences of giving by these different subsamples of the population. All right, let's look at how much they're giving. And I want to say that while this is a national random sample, and we're aiming at the top 3%, we're probably not getting that top 1/2, that top 1%. So Bill and Melinda Gates are probably not responding to our survey. Now, if they were, I wouldn't tell you, because theoretically I wouldn't know. But because they kind of would jump off the page, I would probably be able to figure it out from the data. We receive the data in a de-identified manner, though, so that for statistical purposes, technically I wouldn't know. But just observationally, if you look at our data for this versus the IRS data, it does a pretty good job, but it doesn't get into the stratosphere of the very highest. Average giving for these households, almost $30,000 in 2017. So, if you look at the IRS data at the very high end, this is not capturing that, right? But $30,000 compared to U.S. households overall, they're giving, more like $2,000 to $2,500 a year. This is pretty different. Okay. The bottom 97%, we just talked about that. Among donors, so if you look at donor households only, 25-20, so about $2,500. Okay, so it's an order of magnitude difference really between the bottom 97% and the top 3%. Secular giving, we see some differences. And congregational giving, we see bigger differences. But the key things are these, in the high net worth households are giving an order of magnitude more both to secular charities and to religious charities. So when I say religious, we're not talking about, I have all three of my degrees from the University of Notre Dame. It's a Catholic institution. A gift to Notre Dame would count as a gift to education. Okay, might be motivated by Catholic values, spiritual values, right? But it counts as a gift to education. The religious giving is strictly gifts to mass, mosque, synagogue, congregation, televangelists, Bible sales, and radio evangelical type shows, okay? So very specific, very narrow, very intentionally, okay? Now, we know that spiritual values may undergird all of some people's giving and none of others, right? So there is this bifurcation, and we get that. All right, so if you look at the one column shows the percentage of households that gave at all to basic needs, religious or spiritual, health, medical research, and so on, and then the share of the total giving, the dollars, the share of the dollars, and the other side. And if you look at this, they're not identical in order, but they're pretty close. Okay, so most people are putting most of their dollars in their highest priorities. Now, one of the things that we asked in this study was, what are their motivations for giving? Okay. Now, there's no polygraph test associated with this, so we don't know 100% accuracy on this, right? Social science research at its best. We ask a lot of people, and you trust that on average they're telling you the truth. But one of the things I think that's fascinating about this as you look at this is most of these things have nothing to do with the charities themselves. How many of you are fundraisers? That's what I guess, yeah, quite a few, right? Okay. So this is kind of discouraging as a fundraiser, right? There are some things, we're working hard to go out and raise money, right? And we're trying to, brand our charity as best we can. We're trying to have good deeds to market to donors and foundations and so on. But at the same time, when we ask high net worth households, what are their key motivators for giving? Most of it is about them and their values and what are concerns to them. So as a fundraiser, you have to understand that going into the conversation. On the other hand, so we asked them, why did they stop giving to a charity? And I'll just say, this was my idea, and I think it's brilliant to add this question. And it's fascinating because, again, the donor's values play an important role. But there are more things in this slide that the charities can do to annoy a donor, right? So as a fundraiser, not as many things we can do on the fundraising side, but there are a lot of things that can get them to stop it. And one of the key ones was making too many requests. Okay, so keep that in mind when doing your fundraising. We asked the high net worth households, how can they make a positive impact on society? And I'm not going to go into this, but and these are in rank order. Philanthropy, giving and volunteering were the first two most important things. Now, voting, voting matters, right? I don't know, you may have heard we had an election a couple years ago, and I think a lot of people thought there was going to be one outcome and didn't show up to vote. And found out that a few votes mattered. Okay, so just saying. Right, how do they give? So In the United States, it's estimated that on average, about 5% of households have a will at all. Which is crazy, right? I have a bunch of friends who have children who don't have wills. I have one buddy who was like a multi-millionaire, self-made, bazillionaire type person, and he has a daughter, and I was like, you know, Frank, you need a will. Because people will be coming out of the woodwork to say that they're your heir, you know, if you and your wife both die. And, you know, I'm happy to raise your daughter, I'd be honored to. Don't need your money, put in a trust for her. But somebody will say that they're going to raise her and they're going to rob your daughter's, you know. But, okay, sorry, digression. But it's, you know, it just boggles my mind that people don't have wills. Of high net worth households, only 13% have a will. It's crazy. Okay. 4% have a DAF, 4% have private foundation. And again, this is in our sample. All right. We have another study where we look at publicly reported gifts of $1 million or more. And I can, if you're interested, I can tell you how we do that. It used to be, we used to read all the, like the Chronicle of Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, you know, News and World Report, all the major periodicals, and track publicly reported gifts of $1 million or more. Now we have web crawlers that it's pretty automated and much more detailed. We've been doing this since 2000. This is a little bit hard to read, but what this shows is that along the axis is the number of gifts going to the different subsectors. So one of the things that jumps off the page, that wiggly line indicates a discontinuity, okay, in the scale. So higher ed gets a disproportionate share of the number of gifts. But on the other far end of it, the biggest balloon is the dollar amounts going to foundations. So it's a little bit easier to see this. So higher ed gets almost half of the gifts that are publicly reported of $1 million or more, and they get about a third of the dollars. Foundations get 1% of the number of gifts of $1 million or more, but they're getting over a third of the gifts, dollar-wise. Okay, so high net worth households, most of their dollars are going into their family foundations, and then they're granting them from there. Another estimate, another data point confirming the bifurcation of giving, the concentration of giving, is that when you look at gifts of $1 million or more, which is already a very small sample of American life, right? Of the $1 million gifts, if you look at those of $50 million or more, those account for less than 4% of the number of $1 million gifts, but almost 3/4 of the dollar volume of gifts. So everybody sort of Pareto's, you know, the 80-20 rule, right? I mean, this again is further evidence that philanthropy is all skewed up. All right, so taxes. You know, I'm an economist. If you take my class on the economics of philanthropy, we spend a lot of time on tax price elasticity of demand, and I suspect that nobody in this room would really like to do that, but I think it's fascinating. And one of the fascinating things about this is that people react to this differently. Okay, so some people give because of their personal values, or because of spiritual values, or for other reasons unrelated to the tax code, right? I just want to acknowledge that. In fact, I would go further to say it is irrational to give simply because of taxes. If you're a true narcissist or a true hedonist, and you only cared about your after-tax income, you would never give a nickel to a charity. Because it's a tax deduction off the marginal rates. You're always better off keeping the money for yourself if you only care for yourself, about yourself financially, right? So there has to be some altruistic motivation to making a gift at all. What we see, though, in these elasticities is that lower income households are much more tax sensitive with respect to their giving than higher income households. And that might seem counterintuitive at first. You know, the higher net worth households They've got better tax attorneys, better tax accountants, they're planning, right? They have more to plan with, so they might be more tax price sensitive. But heuristically, if you think about the fact that lower income households, they're making a bigger sacrifice to make a gift, right? If you're choosing between, how much do you have to eat, how much do if you're choosing whether or not you take a vacation versus how many vacations, that's a different choice. If you're choosing whether or not, to buy more clothes that you need versus whether or not you make a gift to your mass mosque synagogue, that's a different conversation. We did a study that was funded by an independent sector, which is, if you're not familiar with this, kind of the lobbying organization for all charities in the United States. And I served on their public policy advisory committee, so just disclose its conflict of interest. And I said to them, you should hire us or someone, this is before the tax bill passed, to do a study of this. Right? What would be the likely impact of the tax bill? And they said, yeah, you're right. So they hired us to do this. We're working on another contract for them right now, so self-disclosure. And I told them, they said, well, can we only publish good results? If the results are like what we want. I said, well, you can do whatever you want. I'm going to publish the whole damn story. So, I'll give you a little lead time so that, buyer beware, right? Caveat emptor. But what we found was that if we added a universal deduction so that everyone, regardless of whether you're an itemizer or not, got a charitable tax deduction, that would increase charitable giving by about 4.5%. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, the bill, now this was based off of before the bill was passed, right? So people want to know. So we didn't have the exact details, but it was pretty close based on what had been proposed. Our estimate though was that if the tax bill passed, it would lower household giving by about 4.5%. Now, because the universal deduction would become even more important if the tax bill passed, because so many fewer households would be itemizers, then that would still have a universal giving deduction would still have a positive impact on philanthropy. All right, donor advised funds, DAFs. Do you have DAFs here? Okay, sorry, I should know that. But so how many of you are DAF haters? Okay, one person. How many are DAF lovers? Okay, a few fundraisers, right? All right, so I wrote this essay for Nonprofit Quarterly on DAFs, and I've been on the faculty for 31 years. I have never gotten so much hate mail about everything else that I've published in my life as I did about this one essay. Okay, so people are, there are haters out there, I'll just say this. So, and I didn't start out as a lover or hater. I was just like, here's an interesting thing, let's look at it. And the editor managing editor for Nonprofit Quarterly asked me to do this. So I was like, okay. So anyway, so DAFs are popular, I think, for a variety of reasons. One is because sometimes donors have a liquidity moment. They inherit a bunch of money, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes with reasonable expectation. Sometimes they sell a business, right? And but they know they want to make a permanent commitment to philanthropy, but they don't necessarily know all the details about who, what, where, when, and why. Sometimes you're selling a business, and that happens quickly, and you're working out the business deals, and you don't necessarily want to or have the time to work out the philanthropy details, but for tax purposes and as a commitment, you want to create a DEF. So another motivation is anonymity. So I have 3 degrees from Notre Dame. My mom is like huge Catholic. If I started making gifts to Planned Parenthood, it would be through a DAF. I'm just saying. Because if I made gifts to Planned Parenthood, my mom would think that I was going to hell, and that she was too for having me to have such a child as making gifts to Planned Parenthood. Okay? I'm not saying anything bad about Planned Parenthood. I'm just saying about my mom. Okay. All right. So dollar values going into DAFs. There have been a couple studies of that. We did one, and the National Philanthropic Trust did another. Their estimate is that the dollars going into DAFs has doubled since 2008. Ours is that it's tripled. Either way, it's gone up a lot. Again, another data point that high-end philanthropy is playing a bigger role. All right, so further evidence, and I'll try to go a little bit faster, but I'm near the end. So total household giving over the last 40 years has grown 140% in inflation-adjusted dollars. And if you just saw that, you'd say, wow, that's great. But if you exclude household giving, total giving has grown 439%. Okay? If you look at non-corporate foundation grant making, okay, so the family foundations, the private foundations, non-corporate foundation grant making grew 726% adjusted for inflation, about 5 times the rate of household giving. So clearly, giving at the highest end is growing way faster than giving by normal households. I mentioned the incidence of giving has gone down by ordinary households, the bottom 97%, and this kind of graphs it out for overall giving, secular giving, and religious giving. At the bottom, the numbers are the dollar amounts given in each of the waves. You see the dollar amount among donors hasn't changed that much. It goes up and down a little bit, but it hasn't changed that much. The incidence, though, of giving has gone down. So I think one of the things in the nonprofit sector in the United States to be concerned about is if you're the leaders of charities, your fundraising pool is getting smaller, but also who you're representing. If you say we're representing a part of the civil society, that's a smaller and smaller share of our society. One other piece of evidence, and I made a mistake on, so column 3, the heading should be total itemized charitable gifts of in billions of current dollars for those whose adjusted gross income was $1 million or more. So column 2 is all charitable itemized gifts for these 3 different years. Column 3 is those from high income households. Column 4 is column 3 divided by column 2 as a percentage. All right, so in 1993, high net worth giving as a share of itemized giving was only 10%. In 2004, it was 20%. And for the most recent year for which we had data, 2015, it was almost 30%. So you see, giving by those earning $1 million, that's not net worth of $1 million, that's earning $1 million of AGI in 1 year. Their giving as a share of total itemized giving is almost 30%. Such a dramatic change in the last couple of decades. That's more about that, so I'll skip that. One of my favorite talking points about philanthropy is that for every year for which we have data, more people donated cash to a charity than voted for president. I just gave you this little spiel about elections are important and voting is important, but more people are choosing to participate in the civil society through their philanthropic giving than their voting. And it's free to vote. Now, as an economist, I have to point out the opportunity cost of your time has value too, right? But it's free to vote, and it's costly to give, and yet more people are giving than voting. So I think that says something about the role of philanthropy in our civil society and the importance of that. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. I think one of the things we've seen is that philanthropy plays an important role in our society. The giving at the median and lower end of the scale has gone down, both in incidence and in impact, and yet total giving is going up, total household giving is going up, and that is being driven by, increasingly by, larger and larger gifts from a smaller share of total households in the United States. Now again, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? So just for the record, I'm not a hater of big gifts. I've gone out and raised a lot of big gifts, and very grateful to our donors for them. And at the same time, as a democratic society, we have some small d. We have to keep in mind that that plays a role in our society if high net worth households and ultra high net worth households are dominating the philanthropic landscape. All right, so I'm going to stop there and. Susan, do you want to say?
our question, is the same thing happening in Canada? I gave away a little bit of a hint of that there might be differences. But Mike, let's take a look at the picture here.
Let me first see if I can get this working. So just before I start, I don't often share the stage with an academic, and I might have expected that if I did, it would be easy for you to visually identify who was the banker and who was the academic. I'm not sure that's the case today. I also just wanted to comment on the issue of DAFs. I didn't put up my hand. I think they're good public policy, but I really don't like the rules of the DAFs that we have in Canada. I think if the average Canadian got wise to the fact that wealthy or really high income Canadians could stuff millions of dollars away, get the full tax deduction right away, but charities might not see that money literally for 10 or more years, I think there'd be outrage. And that's the rules we have. So I'm in favor of DAFs, but I would change the rules to say it's got to be spent on charitable causes within X years. So just a little diversion there. So in contrast with my distinguished co-presenter, I present at best a layperson perspective today. I've done lots of fundraising. I've been on lots of not-for-profit boards where we've relied on fundraising and charitable donations. And as Susan said, I've worked on this Personal Philanthropy Project now for 3 years, I think, with Bruce McDonald and Imagine Canada. And I'll tell you a bit about that today. I suppose in addition to that experience, you might also surmise that as a banker, I'm well rehearsed in getting money out of people in any case. My message today will be the following, that many Canadians are tremendously generous, but others don't give or don't give very much. And in addition, the percentage of Canadians who are giving is declining, and therefore looking forward, particularly because the needs that charities serve are rising, we need to increase charitable giving in Canada, and I'm going to talk about one way that we might do that. So let me start with a few general comments about charitable giving in Canada. So for sure, charities in Canada have a major impact on our country. They account for 8.5% of GDP, which surprises lots of people. 93% of Canadians care about charities and think they're important, and that's why there are many people who give generously in Canada to charities. In 2014, individual Canadians, so not corporations, gave approximately $14.3 billion to charities. That's just 1 year, so that's a lot of money. And the amount that Canadians give has also been rising. So in the last 30 years, donations claimed on tax returns have increased by about 150% in real terms. So that's after inflation. And the average gift has doubled. So that's a significant increase, and that is obviously good. However, while the total giving is up, the number of Canadians who give anything at all is down. So the percentage of tax filers who claim a donation has gone from 29.5% 30 years ago to 20.8% 30 years later. In other words, the number of people who give in Canada has gone down by a third in those 30 years, and now only 1 in 5 Canadians give to charity, or at least claim a tax benefit for the donation. And it's been a steady decline over those 30 years. So just to summarize so far, fewer people giving, but giving more, donors down by a third, and their average gift has nearly doubled. And wealthier Canadians are giving more. I've got a blank screen here. Do you have a blank screen? All right, okay. Wealthier Canadians are giving more. So in 1984, this is actually pretty dramatic, the top 1% of tax filers accounted for 16% of donations. Now the number is 31%, so that's nearly doubled in the 30 years. Now many of you would say that that's as it should be, and I agree. More about that later. The donor base is also getting older. So donors over the age of 50 now account for 74% of all donations. That's up from 54% 30 years ago. That's a big change. And what's even more extreme change is that donors over 70 now account for 30% of donations. That was 16% 30 years ago. And not surprisingly, young donors, those who are 40 or under, have gone from accounting from a healthy amount of 42% of donations to just 22% now. I got the black screen again. You do too? It's coming. All right. I'm moving through them too quickly? No. All right. He looks sad as he shakes his head. I'll be more modest in my pace. And the absolute value of donations has gone up for nearly all categories except for those under 30 years old. So if you actually look back at giving patterns over the last 30 years, historically it's been the case that every generation, so boomers, pre-boomers, Gen X, have evolved so that their giving increased significantly as they aged. That is not the case for Gen Y, for the Gen Y generation, and that's of course a source of huge concern for charities. So to put a positive spin on all of these data, you're forcing me to slow down now, that's good. If I won't listen, you'll force me. Do I need to push it again? Or there we go. So this is the positive spin. There are many generous Canadians, and those who give are giving more, and the wealthy in particular are giving more than they used to. But the more negative spin would be that the number of donors who support charities is, as I said, down by a third, that they're aging, and younger people do not seem as interested in giving as they used to. And on balance, in my view, these trends are really troublesome. Fewer donors, aging donors, less inclined young donors. And if you just take the aging donor issue, if you think about it, 30% of the total that's given, so $4.3 billion, is being given by people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's going to transition soon. Transition is a nicer word than dying. And younger people are unlikely to take their place given the trends that we're seeing. So it is troublesome. You heard earlier that Canadians give less per person or per tax filer to charity. The number is 0.6% for Canadians. The number is 1.43% for Americans. We can come back to this in the discussion phase. This brings me to my next point, which is that the needs that charities serve are rising. So the social deficit is just a simple concept that contrasts the supply of social services provided by charities and not-for-profits with the supply, or with the demand for those services. So in other words, if demand for the services exceeds supply, we have a social deficit. And Brian Emmett, who is the chief economist at Imagine Canada, has determined through his research that Canada's social deficit is rising, that it will continue to rise, and it could be as big as $23 billion by 2026. So $23 billion is a lot of money, and 2026 is soon. So this is a problem. So both demand and supply, by the way, are contributing to this deficit. The demand for charity services is rising because of factors like an aging population, like continued immigration flows, like different family structures, and slower economic growth in Canada. The supply pressures include this issue of fewer and older donors that we talked about. They may just not keep up with the rising need. And the fiscal pressures on governments is another supply issue, both because they make it difficult for governments to continue to help charitable organizations, but also because they may result in governments delivering fewer social services themselves, meaning that charitable organizations should, in theory, want to step in. So the bottom line, the need for what charities do is rising, at the same time that the number of people who give is going down, and the donors are aging and replaced by younger donors that may not be as inclined toward charitable giving. So this brings me to the Personal Philanthropy Project, or PPP as we call it. So the genesis of this project was simply a conversation that I had a few years ago with a gentleman named Marcel Laugier, who will be known to some of you. He was the CEO of Imagine Canada, is now the CEO of the Lawson Foundation. And what we talked about was really three quick things. The first was that charities actually do incredibly important work in Canadian society. And greater charitable giving could have a tremendous positive effect on Canada's communities, especially in a world of income inequality and rising needs and government fiscal restraint. The second thing we talked about was just our personal experience that some affluent people don't give at all or very much, but that when they learn what others give, or when they learn the impact that their gifts can have, they often will give more, and sometimes quite quickly, and sometimes a lot more. The third point of the discussion was that Imagine Canada's Caring Companies program, which it had created a norm around corporate giving in Canada many years ago. That norm was for companies to give at least 1% of their pre-tax earnings to charity. And that norm is now broadly adhered to among Canada's large corporations. So shortly after we had this discussion, Marcel moved on from Imagine Canada, but thankfully the new CEO was equally enamored with this idea and we continued to work with it. So our goal, the slide is not there again, but the goal is very simply to increase Canadians' charitable giving, and we're going to start with the wealthy and affluent. So this essentially involves changing a social norm, which is a hard thing to do, but it has been done before in Canada. If you think about things like recycling, or smoking, or fitness, or drunk driving, or marriage equality, those were all issues where a social norm was changed because of the deliberate efforts of various advocates. So that's what we're going to try to do. So what have we done so far? Well, we've done a lot of analysis of existing data about giving. We've done our own research, including new proprietary research with affluent Canadians. Let's see if we can catch you up here. There we go. We've tested, and this is important, I'll come back to it, various constructs that might provoke or incent greater giving. We're currently working through how to message and communicate all this work. And then in doing all this work, we worked with many organizations, about 36 as it says, including major charities, their umbrella and advocacy groups, big corporations, big donors, and other relevant constituents. So let me share a few of the things that we learned. Hopefully this graph will come up. Yes, it does. Okay, so this graph shows the charitable donations claimed by tax filers by income levels. And it's data that we worked with StatsCan to put together for the first time. It had never been done for high earners before. So the vertical axis that you can't see now is income given to charity, and the horizontal axis was annual income of the tax filers. So essentially what the slide shows is, you can see it again now? Okay, quickly before it disappears. There's a, yeah, okay. I'm honestly not doing anything. All right. Essentially what the slide shows is that I'm going to try to explain something that Susan said here. There you go. So there's a red line and a black line. The red line is only people who donate. So that line does not include people who do not donate. And that's where you can see that people with very low incomes actually donate more than many people with high income. If you take out the people who don't donate, that effect disappears, and you can see that it's a more smooth increase where the lower your income, basically, the less you donate, and it's about 7 or 5% for the black line and 7% of your income when you get up to $4 million a year, and it's much less than that, of course, for people with lower incomes. This next graph is the one that really interests me, because it shows the percentage of tax filers who claim some amount for charitable donations. And if we can get it back up again, this simple graph, the vertical axis is the percentage of tax filers who claim a donation, and the horizontal axis is annual income. So what it shows is that the percentage of people who claim donations rises steadily with income level. But it shows that at the lowest income levels, 12% of people claim a donation, and 78% of those at the highest income levels claim charitable donations. So an important conclusion from these graphs is that most wealthy or affluent people give, and some obviously give quite generously. And this is consistent with what I said before, you know, that the top 1% of income earners represent 31% of the giving in Canada. But what's also clear from the graph, or not so clear right now, it's clear here on my graph, but that doesn't help you, is that there are many folks, including high earners, who don't give. So I'll click the button. I've got a slide here that breaks it out, but I'll tell you about it. Yeah, you can see it there, however briefly. So at the level of income of $150,000 a year, half of tax filers claim donations and half don't. When you get up to $350,000 a year income level, about 2/3 claim donations and 1/3 don't. When you get up to people with income, this is income, right, not wealth, income of over $1 million a year, 1/4 of those give zero to charity according to their taxable, claimed taxable donations. Now, when I show this to people, they are often surprised at that. They're surprised that 1/3 of Canadians making, you know, $350,000, $400,000 a year don't donate, and that 1/4 of people making 7 figures don't donate. So, from my perspective, surely these numbers represent an opportunity to increase charitable giving in Canada. Now, I should just make one point in fairness. While the numbers are accurate because they come from CRA tax filer data, they may somewhat understate those who give, particularly for the highest income levels. And that's because some wealthy individuals, we talked about it earlier, donate to foundations or donor-advised funds in large amounts every few years, and then they might not donate the next year or claim a donation. And others may reflect their giving through their spouse's tax filings. Having said that, every expert I've shown this to, including those that are familiar with those issues, would say that we have still got lots of people that are affluent or high income who are not giving to charity. So why is this? Well, the only information that I've been able to find on this is actually a study from Patrick's school, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, that looked at it. Now in the US, but it gives us some hints that I think are pretty close to the mark in the US. Let me tell you what they are. So 31% of wealthy donors or wealthy individuals said they just don't want to give. So these are people who don't give, right? They just don't want to give. I'll come back to that. 27% said that family needs are a higher priority. And in fairness, I talk to lots of wealthy people who don't give to charity, but do give lots to needy family members. In fact, for some of them, that's their cultural norm, people who've immigrated from other countries and so on. 20% said that they don't give because they don't have any connection to a charity. 13% said that they don't have the resources despite being wealthy. Now I've heard this, and I would say in their defense that there are people who make a few $100,000 who develop the wrong habits and have the wrong size mortgages and school fees and so on, and literally don't have anything left at the end of the year. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's probably what's going on there. 11% said that they don't give because they have not been asked. And then 12% say that they plan to give at the end of their life. I'd say that, at least in Canada, there is one other thing that I hear from high-income Canadians, and it may explain that top bucket, the 31%. They say that they feel they already give enough because they pay very high income taxes in Canada. So they say, I pay 53% in income tax, so I would expect the government to be able to provide for social services, education, healthcare, and so on out of that. Here are a few other learnings from our research. By the way, I hugely appreciate these frantic efforts to get this to work. I hope you're able to follow it. I apologize for this. So one really interesting thing was, these are focus groups we did with wealthy donors across the country. Those who give below the average believe almost without fail that they give above average, and that they're very generous, and they're very proud of their below average giving, not knowing that it's below average, but sincerely proud. They just don't know. Another interesting finding, half of those who do give, and most of these folks, they were wealthy, so a lot of them gave a lot, have no plan, no process, no benchmark. Their giving is extremely ad hoc and unplanned. Again, to me, an opportunity. And then the last thing that I thought was interesting was that when we spoke with these affluent Canadians in these focus groups, when we got them to reflect on their giving, most of them said to us, you know, I could give more, and what I'm doing now doesn't actually hurt. You know, I could give more. I have capacity to give more now that I think about it, which is, again, indicative of an opportunity. So what do you need to do to get Canadians to give more, given that there are many of them who don't give despite considerable financial means, and clearly some, when you consider that the sums of those who give are averages, who don't give very much at all. So when we did the focus groups across the country, and when we had conversations with focus groups of financial planners, and when we did surveys of affluent Canadians, we got a very consistent message back from them. It was, do not tell me how much to give. It's a private matter. I don't want anybody's views or advice on this issue. We heard that, but frankly, we didn't think we should accept it. Because we believe it is possible to change people's giving behavior simply because we've seen it so many times in our own fundraising efforts. So as I said at the outset, when you sit down with a wealthy individual and they find out that their peer, who they know well, whether it's a neighbor or a colleague down the hall, is giving twice what they're giving, their behavior changes really quickly, most of the time. And when people do get engaged and start to give a little bit and learn the impact of the dollars they give, again, sometimes they multiply their giving by 3, 4, 5, 6 times very quickly. So you can change giving behavior, is my point. So what we did to get at this is we kind of tricked people. We worked with the researchers at Imagine and a researcher at U of T, and we designed a research program where the intent was hidden. So affluent Canadians who were part of this research did not know that the object of the research was to explore giving patterns. They thought it was about an opportunity to learn about a whole bunch of different financial topics like vacation planning, planning for kids' educations, savings, and so on. So in this research, and we asked them up front what they plan to give next year, and then after a fairly long process, we asked them at the end what they plan to give next year. We tested multiple giving constructs designed to increase giving. So for example, we introduced a calculator that would ostensibly help them determine what at their income level they should give. We shared data about what others at their income level have been giving in Canada. We shared a standard. This was different for every person. We shared a standard that said, you know, Imagine Canada recommends that you donate at least 1% to charity, and so on. And the cool thing was, despite all the feedback that we had that people didn't want to be told how much to give, every single construct we tested resulted in significantly higher giving intentions. The most powerful construct was the one around give at least 1% of your pre-tax income, which we loved because it's dead simple, it's easy to communicate, and it's very conveniently aligned with the standard that Imagine Canada has already for corporations. So just to give you some numbers, after being exposed to this construct, the survey respondents on average said they would increase their giving next year by 24%. And to tantalize you with what this might mean, if this norm was adopted, if just those who make 6 figures or more gave at least 1% to charity, it would be another $1.65 billion to charity every year. Think about the amount of good that could be done with that money in our communities. And it doesn't seem like a crazy dream. If you're making 6 or 7 figures a year income, I bet you can live on 99% of that. So if those with incomes above the median gave at least 1%, it's an even bigger number, because now you're capturing the large numbers of people. It's then $4.4 billion. And you know, I could go on, but frankly, even fractions of these numbers, fractions of billions are still lots of money, would be a huge improvement and have big impact. So what we're now doing is we're working to start a multi-year program to try to address this issue with affluent Canadians. It's work in progress, but it will include elements like marketing and advertising, engagement campaigns, social media. hopefully op-eds in newspapers across the country, speeches by prominent Canadians, prominent to different segments of society, supporting the at least 1% norm, maybe peer-to-peer challenges. We'll have a website that explains this whole concept, makes it easy for people, helps them give and motivates them to aspire to the at least 1% norm. We're going to give toolkits to charities so that they can all leverage this for their purposes. And then the overall program will be stewarded by Imagine Canada, which I think is a credible organization that people trust. So the idea, again, is not only do we hope to generate more money for Canada's charities, but we also hope to engage Canadians more in their communities. This is an amazing country, Canada. We have a unique culture. People care about each other. They care about communities. They care about their country. So getting Canadians more engaged can only make communities and Canada an even better place for us all to live. So I was going to close by just quoting something from the Rideau Hall Foundation's recent report, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the 30 Years of Giving report. I thought it kind of captured what we're trying to do here. What they said was this in their conclusion. They said, charities are a key part of our society and our economy. They are integral to our conception of what being Canadian means. In every community across the country, they deliver health, education, and social services. They cater to our cultural, recreational, and spiritual needs, and they work to protect animals and our natural environment. So with PPP, we very simply want to provide more resources for those charities, get Canadians more engaged in communities, and with that, I will stop. I think I've gone over my time. I thank you, and I look forward to tonight's discussion. If you now come up here and this thing works perfectly, I'm going to be really bummed. It could be operator error.
Thank you for your good cheer in, let's see if I just move this back a little bit so let's see. I want to start the conversation by asking about the data. So, Patrick, most of the figures you were quoting were people's reported donations, right? Mike, you were talking about the tax filing. Does it matter? Would we, if we looked at self-report in the Canadian context versus tax filing, would anything change? So do the data that we're working with work for us?
Go ahead.
Well, there are data that would indicate that giving levels are higher if you ask people, what they donate. And in fairness, those surveys would get people to answer questions around, the money that goes to the cookie sale at their kids' schools, those kinds of things. So I think the tax filer data, understates the giving. But there was an effort in the 30 Years of Giving report to quantify that, and I think it was a magnitude of about 40% higher. I guess what I would say is that even if you looked at that stuff, I think you'd find the same trends and that your overall conclusions would be the same.
So our starting point is decent enough to take us to the story we got to.
So I have a paper immodestly titled Methodology is Destiny. And
Our students will love that.
yeah, and so we compared 7 different survey methodologies for giving. In fact, Michael Hall from Imagine Canada had one of them. So we've replicated his methodology, and we use several others. And one of the things we find is that methodology does matter. I mean, so if you just ask one question, did you give last year, and if so, how much? People underestimate how much they give. And but if you prompt them with, did you give to your congregation? Did you give to your alma mater? Did you, you're not leading the witness per se, but you're providing some prompts. They're more likely to come up with a more reasonable number. But I think, the key takeaway is, looking at these different methodologies, you get some differences, but the overall trends are similar, and especially with a number of prompts. I think for tax filing purposes, one of the challenges, one of the reasons we want to use survey research is because in the United States, the IRS doesn't collect data for giving for non-itemizers. And so only 30% of households before the tax reform were itemizers, and it's estimated that that number is going to fall in half. And so for the vast majority of households, you would have no data about giving if you just looked at tax returns. And a lot of my economist friends around the country do only look at IRS data. So, there's pros and cons to that. But I think another piece on the tax itemization is that some people don't include their religious giving because they think that as a matter of faith, and that is not something that should be deducted. And so I think for a lot of reasons, the IRS tax filings underestimate actual giving.
And just to be clear, if we think that, the U.S. has this enormous portion that goes to giving, faith-based giving, and we're much smaller in Canada, that's not the case. They're roughly equivalent. It's about 42% here, so it's not as if there's a huge difference in that. But let's go to the good stuff. What accounts for the differences? Is it if we reduce taxes, would we come to a different outcome in Canada? How do we explain the somewhat different stories you've told?
So one of the things, so Americans, for Giving USA, we brag about the fact that Americans give a higher dollar amount and a larger share of income, a larger share of GDP than any country in the world. So, so we study this. I'm a quant jock. I look at the numbers. On the other hand, there's those cheerleading aspects of this where we're kind of rah rah rah. But one of the things I'm careful to point out to the media and audiences like this is also in the United States, we have, although you would never guess this from the rhetoric and the dogma of the politicians, we have the lowest average tax rate of any industrialized Western nation besides Japan. And so, rightly or wrongly, we are making a very different choice about how to fund our civil society, how to fund society overall, right? So, I work for a public university. State support is only 17% of our total revenue. 17%. When I joined the faculty, it was 75%. So that's a very dramatic shift just in my tenure, right? And you look at, and most, you look at public universities, tuition's about $10,000 a year, total cost of attendance about 20. Private universities in the United States, it's about 5 times that, okay, for tuition. Okay, room and board's roughly the same. You look at healthcare, so in Canada you have socialized education to a larger degree, and you have socialized healthcare to a much larger degree. If you believe that the government's paying for it, and it is paying for a larger share, people are less likely to give. And so, what we see is in the sectors in the U.S. where there is more government care or there's a growth in government funding, there's usually a decline in the market share of philanthropic giving. So I think part of that is the bundle of goods and services between tax support and philanthropic support.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the tax issue and the degree to which governments provide services are two drivers. I would I won't repeat everything you said, but if you look at Scandinavia, for example, which have higher taxes than Canada and more government services, the giving per person there is about 0.1%. We're 0.6, US is 1.4 or 5. So that would be consistent with that theory. I would just say though, I've lived in the US for years, I've lived in Canada for years, I've been in every single state in the US, every single province in Canada. There's a difference. There's something in the United States around civic boostership or community focus that's different than in Canada. And I'm not being critical because they're different countries. And by the way, it goes for the South, it goes for the North, it goes for Democrats, it goes for Republicans, it goes for independents. There's a tremendous duty to do things for the community and your fellow citizen in America that I observed in all my time there that I think is different than it is in Canada. That's not empirical, but one man's observation.
No, and I think it's fair to say, Americans take great pride in being philanthropic and a sense of, go back to Tocqueville and so on, this communitarian perspective. And I think one of the things in terms of the community building, what we're measuring is just formal giving, so giving to a charity, right? And my wife's name is Lisa, and I call her Socialista because she's probably the most socialist person you'll meet in a socialist country, and we're not very socialistic, but but her care is really more about low-income members of her family, right? So a lot of our giving is informal giving, right, which doesn't count in the IRS and in Giving USA and so on and so forth. And so it's still philanthropic, it's still altruistic, but it doesn't get counted. And so I think, in all of these studies, we have to acknowledge that it's underestimating the philanthropic contributions that are being made across society. And as Mike mentioned, in some societies, some cultures, that's the only giving that matters.
We've given you a lot of data, a lot of questions, so let's open it up to some questions from the floor. And please identify yourself. And there are microphones in the middle. Yes, could you go to the microphone, please?
Sorry, thank you for giving a lot of good information. I'm a professor in the business school, but I'm not here in that capacity. I try to help the university in gathering some money and so on that. So just to comment or question in a sense, like Canada seems to be a land of immigrants, and a significant number, majority of us, come from countries where diversity is too much, poverty is too much, poverty and richness both sides. And knowing lots of donors in at least in the Middle East and Asian countries, people do donate to their country more because they feel the need is there more, and there's no charitable receipt or IRS or CRA accounting for that. There are only 1 or 2% of the charitable organizations in India or countries like that are acknowledged or counted here in the CRA system. So that's a major aspect in a sense, I would say. The second small comment or question in a sense was, one of the barriers which you listed, very impediments of donation, I found out after talking to good 20, at least 25 wealthy donors, their first question comes to is, what proportion of my dollar will go to the end user? At that factor, I didn't see that. Maybe it's in some other study. Because that's a question everybody asks, that if I have to give it for water supply to poor, I'll give you $100. How much will it reach to that village? And how much will it go in between that? And incidentally, educational institutions stand very high rank in that level. So we are more successful than other charities.
Let me take one more question, and then we'll give you a chance to think on those as well. Again, please identify yourself.
Hi, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Patrick and Mike. This relative Canadian-American perspective. Oh, my name is Kevin. I'm a alumni donor. I have one simple question, Mr. Mike. Define Canadian wealthy, Canadian affluent. We've got a bit of an idea of the American number. So what's Canadian wealthy and what's Canadian affluent, please?
So all of the studies that we did in terms of focus groups, surveys and so on, we were solving for both income and wealth just to select people that had significant means. So the minimum threshold was $250,000 in income, $500,000 in investable assets. But most of them had much more than that, so a much higher number on average.
Okay, what I was looking to is, in my world, the affluent are not the wealthy. As a matter of fact, years ago I heard this. The affluent have high cash flow and not great assets. The wealthy have assets and low cash flow. that there is a sub-distinction there, but for you, wealthy and affluent, is that 250 plus group?
I think, you can be very precise about these things. As a banker, I've done tons of that over the years, and I agree with you that the two things are different. But broadly speaking, our principle was this, that we'd love to get all Canadians to give more. It'd be a great thing for the country if every Canadian donated some small part of their, of their income or wealth to charity, because it gets people engaged. But we knew that going out to Canadians and saying, everybody needs to give more, when a quarter of people who made $1 million or more every year weren't giving a penny, was not a smart strategy. So we haven't been too worried about, figuring out exactly where the line is, but we're focused on people with more than $150,000 in income. But the research was done at 250 and above, just to make sure we were getting those people. Thank you. Okay. I can try. I have by now forgotten the second part of your question, I'm afraid, but so maybe you can just remind me. But the first part, so look, I applaud anyone who is generous and altruistic. As Patrick said, if somebody chooses to give to the needy who are in their family or back home overseas, I'm all in favor of that. And we just have to accept that some of that won't get caught in the statistics, and that's probably okay. But if I think about half of Canadians who make $150,000 or more, the percentage of that half that aren't shown as giving because of that phenomenon is very small. So I would say there are lots of people where that's not the reason that they don't show up as givers. It's very tempting to try to solve for the difference and come up with all kinds of excuses for why people don't give. It doesn't matter how well you do at it. We've done it, and we've done the numbers, and even some of the US-Canada differences. There's still a huge amount of people left over who, if they gave more, we'd all be better off. And sorry, the second part of your question?
The second part was, people do ask what proportion of my money will reach to the...
Oh yeah. So there are probably people here in this room that are better qualified than I to answer this question. I would just say it's a controversial subject. There are many charities that would say, if I spend 30% of the donations to dramatically multiply future donations, that's a much bigger impact than an organization that is very cheap and only spends 10% of the donations, but just stays at a flat level of giving for years. I'm just giving you one example. I think the conventional wisdom that a cost ratio of somewhere in the 20%, maybe a little higher, is what the right balance is. If you get much higher than that, then people start to worry about it. It did not show up in every study. It does come up from time to time as reasons why people don't give, although I would say more with people who don't give than with people who already give.
Can I just add one? So I did a study looking at fundraising and overhead costs in U.S. charities a number of years ago, and there is a wide range, as you can imagine, but there's kind of a central, the inner quartile range is pretty small actually. So, but one of the things that is around 25% for a lot of charities, so we've got fundraising and overhead costs, but. So empirically we can measure it, and we know that it is a reason that some people give for not giving, and it is a reason that many people say is important to them. Most of them have not a clue as to what these actual data are. But one of the most famous examples, so Ted Turner, probably some of the broadcasting, so he gave $1 billion pledge to the United Nations, which he eventually paid off. Over time, but what at the time he said, not one penny for overhead. And in some ways, this is a punitive gift because organizations do have overhead, and they have to cover it. So his gift, for which he got a lot of acclaim, wasn't enabling the organization to do its work, and it's actually then requiring other donors to pay for the overhead to cover the operations of his gift. And so there's a paradox there. But one of the rhetorical questions that I would ask Mr. Turner, or would have asked him, is, well, did you have IT? Well, in your business, that's overhead. Did you have an office? Well, that's overhead. Did you have accounting? That's overhead. Did you have marketing as overhead? Did you have clerical support? You know, and what, did you pay yourself a salary? Again, these are all overhead, and in the for-profit sector, we say, well, that's the natural cost of doing business. And in the not-for-profit sector, we kind of hold our heads in shame and say, oh, we keep that low. And yet, what we know is in the capitalist sector, it's a common saying that it takes money to make money. What I would say in the philanthropic sector is it takes money to raise money, it takes money to do good deeds. And so, but those are tough conversations because that is an important thing to some individuals and to some donors, and you know, we want to be respectful of that. One last comment on the remittances. So Una Kankwa-Asili, who's our associate dean for research now, she's an amazing individual, born in Nigeria, came to Harvard on her own as an undergrad, and then went to Northwestern for a PhD. So she was interested in this question of remittances and used our panel study to look at that. And what she found was that first-generation immigrants did not donate very many dollars to 501c3 legal charities, but remitted a lot of money to their families and communities and so on. Within one generation, this is the power of the panel study, within one generation, their children were donating, I say this, they were still remitting to their home communities, but they were donating the same shares of their income as people who were born in the United States. So, you know, to Mike's point about changing values and inculcating philanthropy as a social good, and as a private value, it can happen quickly.
We have time for two last questions. I'll ask you to keep them short. Yes, Anne?
Hi, thank you both for coming and thank you for this seminar. Thank you for the faculty. Question is really simple. I saw it in your presentation with the deficits, social deficits, and maybe also reduction of donations for donors. How do you see the role of social enterprises in both Canada and the US? Like, do you see them rising, and do you see them having a role with all these deficits and all these reductions? Thank you.
For sure in Canada they're rising, and they are beginning to show the promise that we thought they had, and the numbers are going up. But it's still small enough that in the 5, 6, 7, 8 year horizon, I don't think it's going to be the answer. At least we can't count on it. It's just now that you're starting to see tangible examples where you actually can raise money through these enterprises and show results, and you're starting to get credibility. So I think it's going to take some time, but it for sure is part of the answer going forward. And I don't know if you're referring to this, but corporations are going to be a big part of that because they're in huge flux right now, moving away from the models of simply donating to charities, but instead, as part of their business models, creating social value. And so that's going to be a big part of the answer as well in time.
Yeah, I'd say it's a growth industry in the United States. My biggest, so I do have one concern about this, is that words matter. And if you have for-profit entities saying that we're doing basically philanthropic work, and we're giving you a for-profit return on that as well, that's going to, I think, confuse some donors and change expectations for others. And I think it may make the purely philanthropic landscape both more complicated and more competitive in some ways.
Just to that point, and in answer to a question this gentleman asked as well, remember one thing: we live in a world where governance requirements have been increased dramatically in order to avoid fraud, in order to avoid misspending, in order to ensure that you can demonstrate what you did with the money and that it had impact. That costs lots of money. So if you do run into charities in 2019 that say they have a 4% expense ratio, I would beware, because they cannot possibly put the governance processes in place to ensure that your money is spent for impact.
One last question, and then I'm going to ask for a short statement, the key message that you both want to leave us with. Dr. Wood?
Okay. Oh my God. That's me.
Jacqueline just got her. Finish your patient.
I'm Jacqueline Wood, and I just ran under the tutelage of Susan with SBPA. So I'll try to be brief, but I'm diverging a little bit perhaps because I was very interested in the Canadian figure on the reduced volumes and frequency of donations from the under 40s. And as you pointed out, that's quite a concern, but I was asking myself if the data is available or if there's interest in pursuing data on youth contributions to the nonprofits versus the charities, because I don't know if there is maybe among youth more of an interest in funding, contributing to the nonprofits that they might see as being small p political. So it somewhat ties to your query about, well, people aren't voting, but maybe they're choosing other ways to be political in Canada, especially the youth, by contributing to not charities but to the nonprofits and social movements and whatnot. Just I think that would be interesting. I don't know if that's part of the study with Imagine.
So giving to organizations that aren't registered charities and therefore they can't claim they can't claim a tax receipt even if they chose to.
But still doing activist work and addressing often systemic causes of the reasons that charities are there, needed.
I wish I had an answer for you. I don't. We just don't know. At least we've not been able to find good empirical evidence to support any sort of solid theory on this. Needless to say, I think you asked the question, would we like to know? Absolutely. I can tell you that I've sat in boardrooms with charitable boards, and they're freaked out about this. It's very scary to look forward and see this rising need, and then see this phenomenon, and that maybe the next generation is not going to have the same views about charitable giving. So they would be all over anything you could come up with now that you've graduated and can hopefully procure a whole bunch of research money to do this.
So a last point. As we look at inspiring philanthropy to do better, to do good in a variety of ways, and look forward to the future of philanthropy, what would be your key takeaway as to what we need to think about, what we need to do? Patrick?
Yeah, so maybe a little related to your question. One of the things that we found, and you mentioned this in your data, is that each generation is less likely to give. So we did a study looking at giving by generational cohorts at the same point in their life cycle. And so, because if you look at it, just today, younger generation has a lot less income. But if you look at the same point in life cycle, what we found is that each subsequent generation was less likely to give at all and gave less than their parents and grandparents. So that's disconcerting, right? And disconcerting both from, what does that mean from a democracy, small d perspective, and from a fundraising perspective. From a civil society perspective, I think, though, millennials, a large part of their adulthood was during the Great Recession and immediately following. And so, will their behaviors change? So, the Pollyanna aspect of me says, maybe the giving paradigms will change over time for them, and that maybe for millennials, Gen Xers, and so on, that they'll become more philanthropic over time. But I think it's also a challenge when, even though unemployment is low, many people are working multiple jobs to make ends meet. And so, we have to kind of be careful to gauge where they're at in life cycle and where they're at in terms of disposable income. For those who are truly wealthy, then, we don't want to have guilt and shame as the primary drivers for philanthropy, but at the same time, I think making data available, making information available about what are social norms and what are the needs of charities and the needs of society, I think, can change behaviors and are reasons to be optimistic.
Mike?
Yeah, if I had a magic wand, the first thing I would do to try to change the world on this stuff is address income inequality, because I think that's a big driver of what's happening. In Canada right now, you've probably read in the newspapers, there are statistics that say that 50% of our country are insecure about their financial future. If that's the case, you're going to be less inclined, particularly if you know or if you believe that the spoils of economic growth has disproportionately gone to a few fortunate people. So I think anything from a policy point of view that governments can do to address this without truncating economic growth would be really powerful in terms of addressing this issue. The other comment I'd make is that I've been fundraising since the 1980s, I hate to tell you. And I just can't stress enough this point that if you can just get people started, that's the magic. That enables them to learn. That probably means they get more involved. They might join a board, then they give more, etc., etc. It's just an almost never-ending virtuous circle that you can start. And that leads me to one thing that I should have asked in response to your question about the younger generations. One thing we are seeing in Canada is that young people are much more inclined to get involved in a volunteering capacity than by giving money. That wasn't the case when I was 22 years old. And we have to be open-minded. Maybe the entry strategy is different today than it was, and maybe that's what we focus on. It's just one example. But because that leads to the same place, by the way. Once people start volunteering, then they start giving, and off we go. In general, I just believe that our country and any society is much better if people are helping each other. Susan referred to the academic studies that show that people actually are happier if they give. There's just so much good that comes from it, and that's why we're trying to move the needle on this in Canada.
You've both shown us an important lesson, in addition to the content, that research matters. If we're going to have informed discussions, we need to do good research. We need to understand the phenomena that we're talking about, and then we can decide what to do about it. Mike, thank you for your good grace with some technology problems. Patrick, for coming north. And please join me in thanking them for a great